webinar, we'll have audience and attendees from right across all the societies and states. So on behalf of Perinthalmanna Society, we welcome you all. And we have today very two eminent faculty for speaking on various aspects of obstetric practice. So in this COVID scenario, the topics which we have selected are of utmost importance. The electronic fetal surveillance as well as induction of labor. So we need to do a lot of customization as per the present situation. It is not at all just like before December 2019. We all have changed our personal habits, practices, and everything. Surgical practices, surgical guidelines, everything has been changed. So accordingly, these two situations, which are which is at most importance to all the practicing obstetricians, that is the fetal surveillance as well as the labor induction. So we have organized a webinar to address these two issues. And for this CME, we have the eminent faculty. One is Dr. Umaram from Chennai and Dr. Leta from JIPMAR Pondicherry. So that is the main thing regarding this CME. Last month, we have conducted two CMEs. One is with COVID-19 and pregnancy by Dr. Neena Malhotra from All India Institute of Medical Sciences. And later on, we have an international webinar on how to restart the practices with three eminent faculty from US. Of that, one was SRM Vice President, another one was the US Government COVID Task Force member. So we had a very good discussions, and ultimately, the main problem what we face in this scenario is that one day one guideline will tell us that you should not do this, and the next day the guideline will again, or next week or immediate next hour, a new guideline will come and tell us that you can do that. So the situations and clinical practices are keeping on changing day by day. So in these situations, even though many of us, including you and me, feel that webinars are intoxicating us, but it is a reality that we cannot do anything else to educate ourselves. So the day is that we have to get used to with this webinar, and we have to get educated. But whatever said and done, whether it is inconvenience or intoxicated, whatever it is a fact that all the specialists across all the specialties are getting educated much better than previously, where we all go for the CME programs, spend a lot of money and whatnot, and just come back without getting anything. But at least this webinars, we have recordings, we can look again, and these are quite useful. And for the societies also, no other way out. We have to conduct and we have to get live with this COVID. So at this instance, I would like to invite Dr. Abdul Wahab, our Honorable Secretary of Perinthalmanna ONG Society, to formally introduce our speakers and start the proceedings. Over to Dr. Wahab. Dr. Wahab?
Hello.
Dr. Wahab, please.
Hello. Yeah. Hello. Good morning to everybody. And I'm happy to invite all of you to this webinar. And I welcome Dr. Lada from JIPMAR and Dr. Umaram from Chennai to this webinar. And they will surely share their experiences like in induction of labor by Dr. Lada and Dr. Umaram on fetal surveillance, what are the updates or what are the modifications required in the COVID scenario. And I welcome both of you into this webinar, and I'm not going to waste any time now. And I would like to, I think, who is the first speaker? Who is first speaker?
We invite Dr. Umaram, and she will be speaking on electronic fetal surveillance, and she is the senior obstetrician consultant who is interested in a lot of high-risk pregnancy activities, academics, and publications, and she takes regular classes. And we can now listen a wonderful lecture by Dr. Umaram. Over to Dr. Uma, please.
Okay, Uma madam, please you start with electronic monitoring, fetal monitoring. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Umaram.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar, and thank you to Dr. Kunju Moideen for asking me to do this. Just give me a few seconds while I share screen.
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Okay, so electronic fetal monitoring is everyday stuff. It's bread and butter for all of us who are obstetricians. So I thought we'll just do a walkthrough, a rehash or a recap of some facts about electronic fetal monitoring, and then address how things may be different in the current situation. So the first thing is that if you look at all the recommendations on intrapartum care, it's quite clear that continuous electronic fetal monitoring is not recommended for everybody. And it is not a substitute to provide supportive women-centered intrapartum care. And that is something that we should all remember. We all are comfortable when there is a electronic trace recording a good fetal heart, but just trapping a woman onto a machine does not translate to better care. And I think that is something that is fundamentally important that we should understand. If you look for what are the indications for electronic fetal monitoring, classically there will be two groups of people for whom monitoring has to happen. If they have suspected chorioamnitis, if there's severe hypertension, anybody in whom we have oxytocin use, if there's significant meconium, or if there is fresh vaginal bleeding in labor. The second group will be those who have prolonged rupture of membranes. Again, if you have non-significant meconium along with maybe other factors that are high risk, confirmed delays in the first stage or second stage of labor, and moderate hypertension. So in this category of women, clearly there is a role for electronic fetal monitoring. For the rest, when we say do intermittent auscultation, what do we mean when we say intermittent auscultation? So the thing is, the recommendation is that every 15 to 30 minutes in active first stage of labor, and then every 5 minutes in the second stage of labor. Now, this automatically means that we need to have the manpower to be able to do this. And each auscultation should last for at least 1 minute. And they recommend that it should be over 3 contractions if the fetal heart rate is not in the normal range, which is 110 to 160. And we have to ensure that this auscultation happens timed with a contraction and continues for at least 30 seconds after a contraction. It's important that we record the baseline and then look to see whether there is any acceleration or deceleration. All of this we can do even with intermittent auscultation, is what it implies when you read this guideline. Many of us know that actually in the labor room, the fetal heart is not monitored in this ideal fashion. That very often when they tell us fetal heart is okay, it is not always checked immediately after a contraction. And the only reason to put this up and let this information stay on the screen for this long is not because we don't know this, but because it is extremely important that it is implemented in the labor rooms, and both the senior nurses and the doctors, junior and senior, have to keep reiterating the fact that this is how the fetal heart rate monitoring is done. Okay, so how often do you assess and document? Again, there are guidances about how often one should auscultate and how often one should document whether the once you have auscultated, and this varies based on whether somebody is in latent phase or active phase or second stage of labor. And as we have pushed our definitions of what is latent phase up to 4 to 5 centimeters now, and then active phase of labor is more than 6 centimeters. So that is the recommendation for how often. And so just putting a routine 2-hourly note saying everything is okay is not enough even for documentation. That's why sometimes we are surprised when there is a unexpected problem in the labor ward. It's prudent to make a note whenever this patient is examined, or and documentation is particularly important when there is a significant intervention or there is a substantial change in progress or condition. And I'll come to documentation towards the end of my talk. And it is very important to have a consultant sign on notes at significant points in time. It can't just be the junior most person who is writing and signing off at every point. If a consultant intervention has happened, it definitely needs to be countersigned by the consultant. Now, when we have to do electronic fetal monitoring, one of the important things to remember is this woman should ideally be propped up or tilted to one side. Don't take a prolonged trace with her flat on her back. And that is something that again happens very often. So keeping some kind of a wedge or a pillow available in the labor rooms when the woman is in labor, and educating our nurses that the women need to be propped up periodically is important. Now, once we have the recording, as I said, just strapping the woman onto the trace and seeing the trace alone is not enough. We have to interpret the trace, because misinterpretation can lead to inappropriate actions and inappropriate decisions. This can be both ways. It can be a delay in the care that we are going to provide, or an unnecessary intervention which was not indicated because the trace was not as ominous as it was made out to be. So both of these possibilities we need to keep in mind. The interpretation of the trace is particularly important because the interpretation actually gives you an idea as to what is the nature of hypoxia that is evolving. And the whole point of electronic fetal monitoring ultimately is to prevent a perinatal mortality clearly, and to reduce perinatal morbidity and hypoxic injury. So based upon the nature of the trace, what we are trying to identify is what type of hypoxia. And we know that there are 4 types of hypoxia that are possible: acute hypoxia, chronic hypoxia, subacute, and evolving. So when we say acute hypoxia, we need to remember 3 things, the rule of 3 common reasons where you can get acute hypoxia: abruption, scar dehiscence, and cord prolapse. What do we see? Usually we'll see a single prolonged deceleration, or repeated prolonged decelerations, or prolonged baseline bradycardia. And here, assuming that this baby has been well up till that point, we anticipate that the fetal pH will drop at the rate of about 0.01 per minute. So 90% of the time, there will be recovery by 6 minutes and 95% by 9 minutes. And so that gives us also the time frame in order to act. So in terms of by when should we actually have this delivery of this baby, and by what time should we have actually mobilized this patient to theater. And this time is something that I want us to hold in our thoughts when we are talking about the current situation. The next is subacute hypoxia. Here, the baby is actually having repeated episodes of hypoxia. Now, this you will see as repeated decelerations. And here, what we have to keep in mind is the duration of time in which this fetal heart trace is in the phase of deceleration versus the time at baseline. Now, if there are decelerations happening occasionally, but the baby is actually more of the time maintaining its heart rate on the baseline, then there is time for recovery. Now, in this situation, the pH will drop about 0.01 every 2 to 3 minutes. And all of us who have heard Professor Arul Kumaran talk about this know of the example that he gives about a child, or of dipping somebody into the water. If you hold someone's head under water for some time, then bring them out and give them enough time to breathe, and then dunk their head again underwater. If they have had enough time to catch their breath and replenish their oxygen reserve, they will be able to hold their head underwater for the same duration of time. But if you don't give them enough time out of water, then over a period of time, the number of seconds with which they can actually stay underwater will start reducing. And the same is true in the evolution of subacute hypoxia. So if the duration of deceleration is 2 to 3 times greater than the time spent at the baseline, or if the drop in the fetal heart rate drops to below 80 beats per minute, then the circulation may not be sufficient for optimal gas exchange, and so high fetal hypoxia and acidosis will develop at a faster rate. The third is a gradually developing hypoxia. Here you will have a stress, and that will be seen as loss of acceleration or a rise in baseline, to distress, where you will actually see tachycardia with decelerations, and then finally loss of variability and fetal bradycardia. So here you want to intervene before the collapse. You don't want bradycardia and loss of variability to happen, because then you will have a compromised baby. So at the same time, at the first sign of stress, you don't want to go in and deliver by cesarean section. That's not the point of electronic fetal monitoring as well. Obviously, in all these and the points that we say that this is the drop in the pH over this period of time, we are assuming that there is good placental reserve and fetal reserve at the start of labor. So we must be conscious if this is a situation where there is compromised reserve at the beginning. So obviously, if there is a growth restricted fetus, or if there's a small fetus with a small placenta, even if there isn't growth restriction, then this baby probably has lower reserves and will show significant changes to hypoxia even before that expected duration of time. Now, so the interpretation of our CTG means not just saying, oh, there are decelerations for this period of time, but interpreting it in the context of what is happening. And we have to then look at the history, because that gives us whether there are risk factors, do a proper assessment, and then formulate a tentative plan. So there are other such models where they say subjective, objective assessment and plan. Now, therefore, when we are interpreting a fetal heart race, it is important that I like this mnemonic saying clear, that we are contemporaneous in context of what is happening. We have a logical, explicitly clear explanation, and what we document should also be accurate and readable. And as I said, the interpretation is always in the clinical situation, because the same CTG in someone who is fully dilated, in whom we can easily help out with a quick forceps, is different from a same CTG which is happening when somebody is, say, 3 to 4 centimeters dilated, or there are other risk factors. So most of us are familiar with this mnemonic, mothers, which we can use to interpret the clinical situation before we begin the looking at the trace. So there's always the clinical presentation. Then you look at the trace pattern, you interpret the trace pattern, you look at the duration of the trace pattern and interpret it in the context of the clinical situation. And the 4 features of every trace are baseline heart rate, variability, acceleration, and deceleration. Based upon the trace, we know that every feature of a CTG, you can label it as reassuring, non-reassuring, or abnormal, and accordingly the trace itself as normal, suspicious, or pathological. So if the baseline heart rate is between 110 to 160 and the variability is 5 to 25 with no repetitive decelerations, then our interpretation is that the fetus has no hypoxia or acidosis, and there is no intervention necessary to improve the fetal oxygenation state. Now, if any one of these characteristics are not present, but there are no pathological features that is suspicious, a suspicious trace indicates that this fetus has a low probability of having hypoxia, and it allows us time to correct the cause if there is any, in order to improve the fetal oxygenation status, because a suspicious trace has the, if the reason for the suspicious trace persists, this can progress to becoming pathological. And then, of course, if the heart rate is less than 110 and on baseline, if you have a reduced variability for greater than 50 minutes, or an increased variability of greater than 30 minutes, or you have prolonged decelerations. So based on any of these criteria, if you label a trace as pathological, then the fetus has a high probability of having hypoxia or acidosis, and we need to immediately take corrective actions, and if that is not possible, we need to deliver. Now, in our practice, a few years ago, we introduced a sticker so that it is stuck onto our labor sheets adjacent to the partogram sheet. And this sticker, anytime there is a trace that needs that is read by the registrar or whoever it is, the doctor who's on duty, this is like a ready reckoner that's always there. All you have to do is round off, and then you sign off. And when you sign off, you will also say what is your plan and put a sign and signature. This way, many times when there has been panic because there have been a few decelerations, once you actually put it here and you say that they're actually uncomplicated variable decelerations that have lasted maybe just for 10-15 minutes, you realize that you don't have to panic, you don't have to start talking about delivery. And this is one fact that we found very, very helpful in our practice. So as I said, interpretation is again, we have to then move on to an action. And as I said earlier, the action is not always a cesarean section. We can try and reverse the situation if there is something like a tachysystole and see whether the trace returns to normal. So very commonly, especially junior doctors, forget about the TOCO trace. When they call, they don't document or don't start talking about how many contractions. And if there is tachysystole, then we need to have a process for tocolysis. If terbutaline is available, that is something that we can do. This is a priming. She had come in at 38 weeks and 5 days with fever and reduced movements. Temperature was 101, uterus was relaxed. She was not in labor, and this was the trace that we saw. You can, obviously very tachycardic, reduced variability. There is some irritability and contractions as well. And this continued for a period of time. But once we gave her paracetamol, we reduced the temperature, hydrated, sent off a set of investigations and redid the trace actually got better. So the last thing you want in a situation when somebody presents with fever, even though we are worried that fever in itself can have impact and morbidity, you don't want to go in and rush a delivery, especially because you don't know what the cause of the fever could be. So the general conservative measures that you can use include left lateral, because you don't want the patient to be supine, checking maternal pulse and blood pressure, correcting any hypotension. And that's particularly true if we have sited an epidural. But giving nasal oxygen and routine IV fluids are not interventions that are helpful. So this again is a trace. As I said, trace cannot be interpreted in itself without the clinical history. So this depends on the clinical situation, the timing in labor, and whether this person is close to delivery or not. So some repeated training, both for seniors and juniors alike, is important for skill development and teaching and training. I'll just run through a few scenarios. So here was a primip, spontaneous labor, 39-weeker. ARM was done at 3 to 4 centimeters. She had grade 1 meconium. And as labor progressed, this was the CTG trace that was being seen. And you can see some of these are complex variable decelerations that are happening. And they continue to happen, and you can see there's more prolonged bradycardia that is happening here. So now this is a second scenario, 27-year-old primey, 38.2 BMI, gestational hypertension, induced labor, went into labor, labor was augmented, epidural was sited. This is how the trace was. And then second stage, head is at 0, and this is the trace that you see. And you can see that at this point, there is a drop, there's a bradycardia, that actually this bradycardia just continued and didn't pick up for about 9 minutes. She was shifted and a section was done. Now this is another low risk primary induction. Induced with ProPES, actually, she started having hyperstimulation. So terbutaline was given for hyperstimulation. Subsequently, she progressed and an epidural was sited. About 45 minutes post epidural, trace was okay. And then subsequently, she started this kind of a trace that was seen. At this point, she was 9 centimeters, and so she was shifted to theater, and the same kind of pattern continued with repeated decelerations, and so a cesarean section was done. The baby was well, the cord pH was 7.4. So even when the trace looks crappy, sometimes we end up having well babies. But the one of the things that I was asked to address is there a change or is there a modification that we do to monitoring labors or fetal monitoring in the current context of COVID? I looked at various guidelines. All guidelines say no change in labor management. All guidelines say, especially in a COVID positive woman, routine electronic fetal monitoring because of the concern that hypoxia can be there in somebody who develops COVID. Now, in all these three situations where someone has been in labor and then you're starting to see an abnormality in the CTG, or you see a prolonged bradycardia, we know what to do. We know that we have to go in and get this woman delivered if she's close to delivery or otherwise. But the problem happens when you have unscreened women, which increasingly is what we are having. We do screen based on symptoms, but we don't have any, we don't have in all places everybody being tested. So what are the logistics in this case? And what about PPE use? What about the preparation of the room? And what about anesthesia? I think these are four or five factors that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about our response to interpretation and intervention that is generated from a electronic fetal monitoring trace, which necessitates action, shifting the patient from the labor room to theater and then attempting a delivery. So here, the issue is going to be one of personnel. Now, how many people are going to be involved in this care of this woman if we don't have the means of screening everybody and we are going to say we'll treat everybody as asymptomatic positives? How many people are going to, we want to minimize the number of personnel contact that we come into, healthcare workers who come into contact with this woman. Then we may not be able to have a team of 5 or 6 people available. So then that's one issue with personnel. The other is, especially in smaller units, if there has been inadvertent exposure and we have to rest our staff, then again, the number of people who are actually available is going to be less. With the use of all our shields and masks and hoods, communication is not, it has to be very, very clear. We should have predetermined signs, and sometimes we cannot identify who is the member of staff that we are talking to as well. And therefore, a name on the shield may be something that is important to ensure that communication is done clearly. The other two issues that I want to focus a little bit on is equipment sharing and equipment cleaning. Now, it's all fine to say that everybody must have a continuous fetal monitoring in labor. But if you're a busy obstetric unit, then generally the CTG machine is put on a woman, it's disconnected, and then immediately the next patient comes in and the CTG machine is strapped on. And it is not just about cleaning the Toco probe with sterilium. It is also, what about the bands? What about the cords? So ideally, they recommend that you should have a Bluetooth enabled distant monitor with which you can view without contact nearby. But this is not readily available in all units. So these are things that we need to think through. Then there will be delays because you need time for staff to clean equipment before they are reused. So it's important that we have various protocols in place. We check that there is stock in the labor room of additional PPE if needed. And this happened to us in the start of this pandemic, where we had somebody who had there was a maternal collapse, and we needed to actually stabilize her and potentially provide her airway support. And there were not enough PPE available for the team to wear and manage her airway. So I think even though we know we should have it in place, to actually have it readily available and not each one going to get one thing is something that is important. It's important for us to run some of these dummy drills and say, okay, if there is prolonged bradycardia, how much additional time is this going to take for me to shift this woman from theater to labor room? Who are the personnel who are going to be involved if this woman moves from theater to labor room, and then I end up delivering her in the labor room, in theater, vaginally, or by cesarean section. So all of this is required to be thought through, and definitely senior input on the floor is extremely important because quick decisions can be taken. Now, in the last segment, I just want to emphasize a little bit on documentation, because particularly in this time where we are very focused about healthcare worker protection and COVID is filling our brains, we cannot forget the medical legal implication of electronic fetal monitoring and the documentation. So the name, identity, date, and time have to be monitored. And here we have to always double check that the time on the CTG paper is in sync with the CTG, with the actual time that is happening then. Somebody may have come to service the machine, they would have readjusted the time, readjusted the paper speed and go away. So we have to ensure that the CTG clock is in time, because many an hour has been spent by defense and plaintiff counsels and their experts to make sense of discrepancies in time on the fetal heart monitoring strips and the medical records. Because even a few months later, we will not remember. So it is very, very important for us to make the CTG strip and our interpretation of it is a medical record. It's also a legal document. And it is this documentation that ensures that we have provided appropriate care and we have communicated properly. So if you look at literature, they say that about 60% of claim reviews, there have been substandard care in electronic fetal monitoring. There's some, there have been appropriate care, but there has been poor documentation. And here the verdict often favors the plaintiff. So the principles of effective documentation include documentation quality. It has to be clear, concise. It has to reflect critical thinking, and we should avoid non-specific terms. There should be a regular review. If the first person has said review in 30 minutes, then a review needs to be done in 30 minutes and then that entry put in. The entries, when we do, we should use standardized terminology and not just our own abbreviations. So accurate, valid, complete. And we have to also show that there is training of staff that is happening and they are competent to interpret and document the CTG. And finally, any medical record needs to be protected, both from data protection and patient information confidentiality. So it's important we begin with contractions, document their frequency, duration, intensity, and whether there's any abnormality of resting tone. Then talk about the fetal heart, note its individual features, comment on the category, indicate your plan with any reason for intervention. And this is the standard recommendation that we teach all our trainees, Dr. C. Bravado, and that is a very good mnemonic to follow always. So it's important to put down. Now, if we say too many contractions, we say how many contractions per minute and put down what is the heart rate, what is the baseline heart rate, what is the rhythm, and then put down the maternal and fetal response to the intervention after we document the intervention. And this can be done on the CTG paper, but also on the notes. And because many places I find there's something written on the CTG strip, like Pitocin drip is started, this is the flow rate, epidural was given. But in the notes, there is no documentation of the same. And this piece of paper, if you have not Xeroxed it, it is going to fade. And the other thing I want to say is you have to know your CTG machine, because many machines give you the opportunity to say what the event is then and there. So you can actually mark on the paper without writing. The machine will auto mark whether the transducer moved or the mother moved or whether a treatment was given, whether we have done a vaginal examination at that time, what is it that we have done in terms of intervention. So by pressing that, we can actually automatically document what is there on the paper. Of course, a small word about twin pregnancies and fetal monitoring. It is important that we have a twin monitor if we are going to monitor twins. If you don't have a twin monitor, then and are going to use two separate traces, then locate the fetal heart, preferably with an ultrasound, mark the site so that you don't inadvertently monitor the same fetal heart continuously. And I think all of us have had that disaster happen where we've had only one twin monitor. So as I said, CTG traces fade, so we need to copy or scans. And if we have the new machines, then the networking will allow storage and traces, and also allows maternal monitoring. So if you have a maternal trace also possible in the same CTG machine, then you will never have the concern about are we documenting a maternal heart or a fetal heart. Now, I said we need to document, and we need to document ideally then and there, but in a busy labor ward that may not be possible. So there is no legal standard for what is late. And up to a 60-minute delay is reasonable if the unit has been busy. So in that case, you have to put down that notes were written at a later point in time because of what happened, and then document what it is. So we have to be clear and legible, as I said, with standardized terminology and interpretation, because what this documentation is showing is proof of competent care. And so whatever should be the frequency with which we put down that we have provided competent care needs to be reflected in the documentation. So at the end of it, sign, print your name, put your registration number, date and time. So the reason I'm emphasizing on documentation is many times the CTG trace is there. The patient may then get shifted from the labor room to the theater. In all the confusion that happens around delivery, is the strip taken? Is the name written? Is it clipped? These are things that sometimes tends to be forgotten. And if and when, God forbid, there is a situation where medico-legally we are asked to defend our decisions without all this documentation, the fact that you did the monitoring has no significance. So in the current context, it is the delay in the response that is inevitable because of the additional precautions that we need to take for our own perspective. That is something that we have to keep in mind. And secondly, the fact that if we don't have an epidural analgesia and you have, like the situation 2 where I showed you there was prolonged bradycardia, if there was no epidural, then giving this woman a regional anesthetic at that time would have further delayed everything, because you are worried about giving her a general anesthetic in the current context of COVID. So it is these factors that will influence the electronic fetal monitoring. There is no change in the electronic fetal monitoring per se. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Uma. That was a very wonderful lecture. And it's very clear in concepts, and specifically the most striking was the most interesting mnemonics. And it should be very useful for the practicing obstetricians as well as the postgraduate students in obstetrics. And so we have received a few questions which I'll quickly go through. Before that, if any of the experts, Dr. Leda or Dr. Wahab, would like to ask any questions, you can just proceed.
Dr. Uma, actually, you stressed the documentation, very important. So we used to see from our postgraduates and juniors, everybody used to do just a document on that thermal paper. And after a few weeks, it will not be there. So it's very important. Documentation on the case sheets, on the case records. That's very important. Dr. Uma.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's documentation is very important. Today, you have machines where you can get it out on regular paper, not thermal paper. And if you have some of these systems which allow you to save the trace digitally, that is also possible. But again, all units don't have that facility. If you have a digital viewing board, then you're also not that much closer to the patient in the current concept. But I don't think all our labor rooms are COVID ready yet. But that is something to think about going forward.
What about the newer machines? There are newer machines which you can have converted into a mobile and all those things that you get through the net, internet, and also the Wi-Fi, even Bluetooth you can use and get the tracing on your
smartphone. There are systems, and I think there are apps as well where as a senior, if you're sitting at home or outside, you can actually have the feed of the patient come in. Of course, the poor man's version of that is a photograph on WhatsApp. And I think that is something that everybody is able to do. The point, of course, is that in that case, somebody has said it, someone has seen it remotely, given a directive. But this entire exchange needs to be captured and documented and not left out, if not immediately, at some point in time. That's what I was trying.
I would like to just, I think, comment, because see, many a times in our kind of busy labor rooms, every patient may not have the access for, the electronic fetal monitoring. It's very important that it's something between the years should not be forgotten. People should document that in the case sheet, because it does happen. See, many times in labor room, everyone doesn't get epidural, right?
Yes.
And patients start jumping, and this electronic devices get displaced. So what happens is, at that time we have to rely on the clinical monitoring. That is something which PG should not forget. I mean, it happens day in and day out. Even sometimes, in spite of having the probe in situ, I keep asking my residents, please check clinically, because the displacement is quite high. So I don't really trust in second stage this electronic fetal monitors, especially those patients who keep, moving. And so we do a lot of clinical monitoring. So that is something which students should not forget.
No, I agree, which is why I emphasized intermittent auscultation initially. In second stage, even if they have an epidural and they're not moving, when there is a lot of abdominal adiposity and the head moves down, the trochotrace often is still up where it was placed when the wound was 6 centimeters. So we all know that the as the head descends, the movement, location of the fetal heart down. So if they don't hear it, sometimes there is panic. So all this is training. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we have few questions. One question is, in this current COVID scenario, is there any specific protocol for cleaning the probes for using in between the patients when you use the same probe for different patients? Is there any protocol have been recommended for cleaning the probes? And
like with any other equipment, you need to wipe down any alcohol-based wipe down you can do, and ensure it dries before you reuse.
And the second part of that question is there any disposable covers which can be put on the probes before will it interfere?
I'm not sure. I haven't read anywhere about covers, and my concern with that is contact. Already external monitoring, you can have loss of contact. If you have a layer in between, my worry is variability will not be picked up very well. So I'm not sure that covers will help.
Okay. Another question is, how much percentage of contraction in Toko machine is considered as fair, good, or strong contraction? Should I repeat? How much percentage of contractions in Toko machine is considered as fair, good, or strong?
In terms of intensity?
Might be.
I think, okay, I hope what I say will clarify. So the first thing to do with the Toko is that please ensure that there is zeroing done. And when you begin the Toko trace, the base, it should be on baseline and not starting off at 20 kp. So very often, if you don't do the zero, you will see that even when in the resting phase, it will show a certain pressure. So that's the first thing. And then you look at both the intensity of that peak and the duration, and both will tell you whether there is adequate contraction. But in a practical sense, if you have somebody standing there monitoring the pressure, that gives you a much better feel for the intensity of the contraction than what is recorded on the Toko.
And one more thing, what's the importance or relevance to exclude abruption, especially in case of hyperstimulation, particularly if the basal tone remains elevated? Will it lead to any wrong decisions or tocolysis as a wrong decision or termination as a wrong decision? What do you say?
See, abruption is a clinical diagnosis. I don't think the Toko trace per se is going to help you make a diagnosis of abruption. But yes, if the baseline pressures never return to zero, then that is it's a cause for concern.
Maybe tachysystole also. It may be tachysystole and it may not be because.
also,
Yeah.
but it will come back to baseline. So which is why
Yeah.
it's important that that baseline starting you have zeroed
Yeah.
when you begin.
Yeah, it will be associated with fetal heart changes as well, isn't
Yes,
it?
definitely.
Yeah.
Significant abruption, definitely you will have loss of variability. You can have tachycardia. You can
And,
have B-cells, all of that.
Yeah,
Prolonged
we have
driving.
two. Yeah, we have two questions which are not really connected with this current talk, but anyone can answer. The current concepts in obstetrics regarding PP and COVID tests, I think it's a very vast. The answer will be very vast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Would you like to comment anything? PP,
PP.
COVID test, and the pregnancy, antenatal care, and or delivery, anything, obstetric care.
See, COVID testing, we were just discussing this before we started. Currently, based on the current ICMR guideline, at least in Tamil Nadu now, they don't recommend testing asymptomatic people. So I think therefore our hands are tied. If you are able to test, then it gives you to screen away those who are positive and then ensure that their facility care happens in a separate location to those who are not screened. Those who are unscreened are in a waiting area till the screening report comes, and those who screen negative, you can take care. The thing to remember is even if they screen negative, they say there's a 30% chance of having a false negative. So the basic PPE use, which is your N95 mask and facial shield, has to be become a part and parcel of everything that we do. If someone is proven COVID positive, then you need the full hood, etc., in order to provide care. But otherwise, N95 mask, a facial shield, obviously gown and glove is the PPE that you need for delivery.
Should the patient also to wear PPE?
Mask. Patient to be masked.
95 mask.
Masked. Yeah. And yes, patient to be masked in the labor room. Often the mask slips away when they toss and turn and talk. So that's important that the patient is masked.
Okay. And I think the questions are keep coming. So we will just summarize before after the next talk. And we'll,
Sure.
And, it's just pouring in. So
Okay.
I have just compiled some questions and asked. We'll move on to the next talk. That is on induction of labor. We have Professor Leda. I don't want to hear our how we call her fondly. That I'll mention personally later on. But she's a very good teacher. Liked by all the PG students. All the PG students, when we meet, they have very high words about her. Very wonderful teacher, very good academician, active person, and a wonderful human being. So, Dr. Leda, over to Dr. Leda for that talk on induction of labor.
Yeah, thank you, Mohiddin, for giving me this opportunity to talk on induction of labor, which I know all of us are doing a lot. I also thank Abdul Wahab, and thanks for the nice discussion which we had before the session started. Let me start sharing the screen. I hope. Is it seen?
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Okay.
Yeah, we can start.
Thank you all. Yeah, the topic is on induction of labor, but I hope I don't induce any sleep in all of you. Okay, so this is the topic which I have been given, induction of labor, current status. Am I audible?
Yeah, very nice. You're very audible.
Okay. So first I'll start with an overview. I'll be defining of ripening and induction. We'll talk about indications and contraindications, pre-induction score, various methods of induction and their limitations and induction in various situations, which will also talk a little bit on COVID. Dr. Uma has made my life very easy talking about all the necessity things which we should take care of during the COVID season. Okay, coming to this, I'm sure this is one thing which is very important. Whatever said and done, spontaneous onset of labor is always the best. I hope you all agree with me, and I'm sure most of you do induction in your labor rooms routinely. Indications may be different, but majority will be the same, but some institutes and some hospitals indications may be different. And with the present newer and safer methods available, I think our threshold for induction has become very low. If you go for definition, induction is a process where uterine contractions are artificially stimulated when there is a necessity to deliver the baby earlier, where waiting may risk the pregnancy outcome. Now, how is it different from ripening? Ripening is just the preparedness of induction of labor to improve the consistency and effacement of the cervix. Now, if you go back to the history, it dates back in 1756, where amniotomy was the first method of induction, which was started by Thomas Denman, and it was going on till 1906. In between, James Hamilton started sweeping off membranes, which currently all of us do. I'm sure majority of us do at term so that the patient goes into labor. In 1906, then Henry Dale discovered that posterior pituitary extract from posterior pituitary causes uterine contractions. And finally, William Blair started using oxytocin in labor. Of course, now we have many other methods coming up. So if you look at the indications for induction of labor, I'm sure all of you will agree. It's prolonged pregnancy, hypertension and its complications, diabetes in pregnancy, RH isoimmunization, premature rupture of membranes, and also preterm premature rupture of membranes. Then fetal growth restricted, whole lot of indications for induction, intrauterine fetal demise, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, intrahepatic cholestasis, abruption, oligohydramnios, and the last one is maternal request. That of course it depends. Most of us do not encourage maternal request for induction. Of course, most of the time the maternal request comes for cesarean section rather than induction. Okay, there are certain contraindications for induction, which all of us know, major degree, or now we call it as complete placenta previa, transverse lie, cord prolapse, obviously, prior classical cesarean section or hysterotomy, vasa previa, active genital herpes, and prior myomectomy where cavity has been entered. So these are some of the contraindications. What are the prerequisites for inductions? As Dr. Uma said, consent is very, very important. You need to take consent from the patient. Delivering a preterm baby. So if ultrasound dates are there, that is the best. Nowadays, most of the patients do have an early ultrasound. So it's very easy to get the dates. Examination, make sure patient's anemic status is corrected, whether she has diabetes or hypertension. Yes, it is important because these become the high-risk group when we need to induce and monitor the patients. Then appropriate maternal investigations, whether they are there. You have to assess the fetal well-being, which was already discussed. I'm not going into the details. And most important is before you induce, you need to assess the pelvis. You need to know whether the pelvis is adequate or not. For this baby, previously she would have delivered a smaller size baby, but now the baby may be bigger, or vice versa. Previously she would have had a section for a bigger baby. Now baby may be small. So we need to assess the pelvis, and most important is to assess the Bishop. All of us use Bishop score to know which agent to be used. So this is the modified Bishop score. What is first thing when we talk about Bishop is the position and consistency, then the dilatation, effacement, and the station. These are all very important. We know that a favorable Bishop score is between 6 to 13 and unfavorable is less than 6. Why we should know this is when there is an unfavorable cervix, just starting oxytocin may not help. In this situation, we need to ripen the cervix. So that is very important to know the Bishop score. So going to the methods of inductions, there are various methods of inductions. If you look at pharmacological, then you have mechanical, and we have also some other non-pharmacological, which I have not mentioned here. Among pharmacological, most often used is oxytocin, then of course prostaglandins and mifepristone, and prostaglandins in various modes, whether it is tablets or gels or vaginal pessaries. Then, as I already told you, sweeping. Some people even do artificial rupture of membranes as a method of induction. Earlier, when we didn't have, when we were doing our postgraduates in early 90s, the only thing which was available was oxytocin, and of course, artificial rupture of membranes. So invariably, patients with eclampsia or abruption, we always used to do with start the induction with artificial rupture of membranes. Luckily, now we have better things. Of course, Foley's and Dial-up-N are other methods of mechanical methods. Then combination. Sometimes using one may not be sufficient. We may have to use along with it or after using the one method. Coming to mechanical methods, sweeping, as I've already told you, it successfully induces labor in 60% of patients. I'm sure majority of us, especially in primaries, we do sweeping at term, at least by 39 to 40 weeks. It reduces the duration of pregnancy to beyond 41 weeks. But sweeping does have problems. Many of the patients do end up in premature rupture of membranes, and if you don't do with aseptic precautions, chances of infections are higher. There are I would be touching on few studies intermittently just to show an evidence. There was a Cochrane systematic review in 2005 where they said comparing sweeping of membrane with no treatment and with prostaglandins and oxytocin, that revealed that stripping of membranes was associated with reduced frequency of pregnancy continuing beyond 41 weeks. Same thing, there was a Cochrane review in 2020. Again, they have told the same thing was associated with reduced duration of pregnancy and reduced frequency of pregnancy continued beyond 41 weeks. Same thing, the same thing, reviewing membrane sweeping may be effective in achieving a spontaneous onset of labor. Compared to expectant management, it reduces the incidence of formal induction of labor. So, but what is the optimal number of sweeps and timing of gestation? We don't really have data about it. When we talk about sweeping, sometimes we also sweep 2 to 3 times, not the same day. First you sweep if the patient doesn't, especially when you're waiting for her to go into labor, that is between 40 to 41 weeks. We do one sweeping. If she doesn't respond, maybe after 2-3 days, we can again try. But majority of them do go into labor. Okay, next mechanical method, what we very commonly use is the Foley's catheter. It is used when the cervix is unfavorable, when Bishop's score is less than or equal to 4. But again, you remember, even though the Bishop is poor, if the cervix is dilated to more than 2 centimeters, then Foley's cannot be retained. Now, when is it contraindicated? Generally, wherever induction is contraindicated, rupture of membranes, again, this is not an absolute contraindication, though majority we do not use. When there is suspicion of chorioamnitis, even with intact membranes, we should not be using Foley's catheter because the chance of introduction of infection is high. Now, how do we insert Foley's catheter? A patient should be in a dorsal position with thighs flexed. We have to use aseptic techniques. Now, you need to use a 22 French Foley's preferably. We cannot be doing induction with 12 or 14 French, which is too less. What we have to do is hold the anterior lip of the cervix with sponge holder. Then you hold the Foley end with either a sponge holder or an artiforceps and push the bulb beyond the internal os. So, and you have to inflate the Foley's bulb to 60 ml. If you are using a 24 French Foley's, you can even inflate it to 80 ml. Then you have to give traction so that the bulb is at the level of internal os. We need to tie the Foley's to the thigh. Of course, this sort of causes some discomfort to the patient, and you leave it for 24 hours or till she expels, whichever is earlier. Some people do extend it for some more time, but 24 hours is a minimum time which we can use. Again, there have been various studies where they have used 30 ml and 60 ml to inflate the bulb, but they found that when you inflate the bulb to 60 ml, the number of patients going into labor is significantly higher. Okay, so I'll just show you a small video. Okay, this is to show how to put in a Foley's. We've just made a thermocol model and we have introduced it. Sometimes when the cervix is not visualized, people can use digitally. You can hold the Foley's in between two fingers, that is the index and middle finger, and try to slowly put into the cervical canal. Then push the Foley's to above the internal os and then inflate the catheter. That means you have to push. How do you know whether you've gone beyond internal os? You have to push as much as the Foley's into the cervix as possible. Then inflate to the 60 ml. Here, of course, we are not inflating it to 60 ml because the catheter which we used is very small. Just to show how to introduce a Foley's catheter. This is very important because majority of the places patient may not be able to afford, and this is a cheaper method to ripen the cervix. So you put it, once you inflate the bulb, drag it so that the first resistance which you feel will be the internal os. Remember, this Foley's bulb should not be in the cervical canal. It should always be at the level of internal os. If it is not at the level of internal os, this purpose will not be served, because the idea is the traction and inflation which cause release of prostaglandins. That is the idea of using the Foley's bulb. Then you need to tie to the thigh. Of course, this is a double bulb balloon catheter, where if you see, this balloon will be into the at the level of internal os, and this balloon is in the vagina. The advantage of this is you do not have to tie to the thigh, which causes an uncomfortable situation to the patient. But again, the problem with this is it is quite expensive. That is the reason. And if you look at the results, whether it is single or double balloon, the results have been the same. Only thing is whether it is efficiency, safety, or efficacy, the results have been same. So that's why it's not taken off very well. Of course, the discomfort of tying to the thigh will not be there if you use a double balloon catheter. So these are the differences. Bishop's score, and when we use a Foley's catheter for cervical priming, you see that 83% of them have delivered. So Foley's had a lesser chance of having a cesarean delivery compared to subjects who had Foley followed by prostaglandins. Okay, so it's a very good method, and it is safe and it is cheap.
Am I
audible? Yeah, I think some other this thing. Okay. Now there is other method of induction with Foley's extra-amniotic saline installation, which is again a very good method, especially in certain situations. How much saline do you give? We give 100 ml of saline over 1 hour. So totally for a period of 6 hours you can give. You can give this or in the last 6 hours of Foley's, but then if you put in first 6 hours of Foley's, the advantage is you are giving an extra method, because sometimes after 6 to 8 hours, the Foley's may get expelled once it gets dilated to 2 to 3 centimeters. Then the opportunity of giving an extra method of induction is not there. And this method is very good in certain conditions like previous cesarean, where you do not have many alternatives to ripen the cervix and induce labor. And we have found a significant improvement in Bishop's score, which favors induction of the cervix. So we have done a lot of studies in JIPMA using Foley's alone and comparing with prostaglandin E2 gel. We have used Foley's, this method of induction, Foley's with prostaglandins, and we have found that Foley's has always been a very, very good method for induction of labor. Okay. So as I said, it is very simple to use, inexpensive and easily available, increase the vaginal delivery rates, and there was no significant maternal, fetal or neonatal complications. When we have compared with oxytocin alone, but when you use the Foley's with oxytocin, the amount of oxytocin which is needed for induction was significantly less. Again, when we use with dinoproston, intracervical Foley's was as efficient as dinoproston. There's no significant difference in cesarean delivery. Induction to labor or delivery interval was also not different. So it's a very good alternative to dinoproston gel. This is the study which we have done in JIPMA recently, where we concurrently used 2 agents for induction of labor, that is misoprostol alone and misoprostol with Foley's. Though we did not find statistically a significant difference, but there was definitely a shorter induction to labor and delivery interval, and higher number of women where we have used Foley's along with misoprostol have entered active labor within 10 hours of induction. So now this is another recent one. I won't say recent, laminaria tent was used earlier. This is another mechanical method, which is a synthetic osmotic hygroscopic dilator, which is produced from a hydrogel. It is a thin, I'll just show you, it is a 4 millimeter rod which expands to over 15 millimeters when kept inside the cervix for 12 to 24 hour period. It softens the cervix gradually because it releases endogenous prostaglandins and causes collagen degradation. That's how it acts. But only problem is it's not enough. If you put 1 rod, we need to put 3 to 5 rods. So this is how it looks like. This is how it looks like initially before induction, before the ripening. Once you put in the cervix, the moisture gets absorbed and then finally dilates to 15 millimeters like this. So we need to put at least minimum of 3, but 5 such rods. Study is being done right now in JIPMA. There are studies done in without scar, and a study is being done in JIPMA with scar. We'll have to see what will happen. Only problem with this is, okay, there was a study which was done between Dilapan and Foley's. There was a difference about 5.2%. What Dilapan told, it's as good as Foley's. But only problem is, this is the thing, it is very expensive. Each rod, remember, each rod costs around 700 rupees. So if you have to put 5 rods, it will cost around 3,500 rupees. Whereas Foley's is not very expensive. It will hardly get it for 80 to 90 rupees. The advantage of using Dilapan is it does not protrude through the introitus. We do not have to keep under traction, and obviously patient satisfaction is much more. Whereas Foley's causes a lot of discomfort, and when you're giving easy, there is restriction of movement. Whenever you put Dilapan, patient has to lie down for around half an hour to 45 minutes, then she can get up and walk. Whereas when we give easy, for 6 hours, patient is sort of bedridden. Otherwise, with Foley's also they can walk around. Then coming to the next one, artificial rupture of membranes. There is data lacking for induction of labor, but in exceptional situations, like I've told earlier, in abruption, it will help, because in abruption we do want to decrease the tension inside the uterine cavity because of the development of clots, especially in concealed abruption. So when all the other methods fail, this still can be tried as a last resort. So sometimes we have put Foley's, we have put Cerviprime, prostaglandin gels, or we've used misoprostol. Still, no, the cervix is not favorable. In those situations, when you think there is really no indication for cesarean section, we can always do artificial rupture of membranes, and after 4 hours, we can start oxytocin. That also has helped in many a situation to allow the vaginal delivery. Now, coming to non-pharmacological approach, there are various components, but these are not really proved of any benefit. Coming to pharmacological approaches, we know that oxytocin is the most common one. It is a neuropeptide which is produced in the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. The presence of oxytocinase and the capacity of oxytocin receptors will tell us the action of oxytocin, will modify the action of oxytocin. What oxytocin does, it elicits rhythmic uterine contractions, and we also know that the uterine sensitivity increases towards term and labor because the number of oxytocin receptors increase towards term. It is available as 5 international unit ampules. Now, oxytocin has a short half-life. There's no particular regime which is superior. People have used low dose and high dose. It depends on us in different situations what we use. Low dose would be 1 to 2 milliunits per minute. Higher dose is 4 to 6 milliunits per minute. Okay, this is how we give. You start around 1 to 2 milliunits per minute. You increase to either depending on how much you have started. If you started at 1 milliunit per minute, you can keep on increasing by 1 more milliunit per minute, and you can increase anywhere between 15 to 40 minutes. Higher dose also similar. If you start at 4 to 6 milliunits, you can increase by 3 to 6 milliunits, and again increase with an interval of 15 to 40. Now, these kind of high doses should not be used in patients where there is intrauterine growth restriction or with previous cesarean, because the risk of fetal hypoxia will be much more and the risk of rupture of uterus may be higher. So low dose is always a preferable method. Now, this is the FOGSI guideline which they are said to use. If you are using 1 unit, you increase by 8 drops is 1 milli international unit. So if you increase to 16 drops, that means 2 milli international units. Then you keep on increasing 1, or you can double it. When you're giving 2 units, you give 2, then increase to 4, 6, 8, 10, so on and so forth. And it depends. Some people use till 20 milliunits maximum per minute, or some people use till 30, not beyond 40 milliunits per minute. That is the recommended dose. Now, there are side effects for this. Fetal intolerance may be there, especially with intrauterine growth restriction, tachysystole, where the contractions are more than 5 per minute, with or without fetal heart decelerations. The risk of rupture uterus is there. The risk of water intoxication is there. And with anesthesia, it interacts with isoflurane and enflurane. What is uterine tachysystole? It is nothing but excessive uterine activity of more than 5 active labor contractions in 10 minutes. Normally, we expect 3 contractions in 10 minutes with a good relaxation. That is what is important, where the intensity goes to 45 to 50 seconds. Whereas here, intensity also may be more, and the number of contractions per minute will be more than 5. It can be without fetal heart rate abnormalities and with fetal heart rate abnormalities. Now, earlier they used to use a lot of terminology, uterine hypertonus, uterine hyperstimulation. Still, there is confusion about these terms. The latest NICE guidelines and all say do use the word uterine tachysystole with or without fetal heart rate abnormalities. Though we tend to use a lot of hyperstimulation. When we say hyperstimulation, it is with fetal heart abnormalities. Now, coming to prostaglandins. It causes contractions along with ripening the cervix. Many preparations, dosages, and routes are available. We have PGE2 gel and Pessary. Pessary, what is available in India is Propes, which is the latest one which we have started, and PGE1, and we have PGF2 alpha. PGF2 alpha has a very minimal role in induction of labor other than intrauterine deaths. This is commonly used for that. So many women go into labor with use of prostaglandins. The most commonly used is a prostaglandin E2 gel. It's available as Dynapros, Saviprime, and many other companies. Most commonly used ripening agent, and it contains 0.5 milligram of dinoproston and 3 grams of gel. Most commonly used is as intracervical instillation, but we can insert even in posterior vaginal fornix. Many of studies or many of the people prefer using high into the posterior vaginal fornix, so that what happens if you put in the cervix is there is a chance for the prostaglandin to go into the extra amniotic space. Okay, and the onset of action is around 30 to 45 minutes. We can repeat this every 6 hourly, maximum of 3 times in 24 hours. And it can be used even with rupture of membranes. If Mohitin remembers, one of our residents, now she's of course in UK, Dr. Srividya had done a study using multiple doses of Saviprime. We have gone up to 4, but of course we have not given 4, we restrict to 3. Prostaglandin E1, misoprostol, now off-label use is very, I'm sure everyone uses this for induction of labor, though it has not been approved by FDA. Of course, each time we have to take DCGI approval. Nowadays, the approval by ethics committee is enough. This is available in a tablet form, which can be used vaginally, orally, or sublingually. I have seen some studies where people have used in the form of a solution, but we do not have any experience with the solution form. As I said, most of the countries use as off-label, especially the oral route. Oral route is commonly used. It is cheap. The most important aspect is it's very cheap, easy to store. You don't have to refrigerate them, and it can be used both as ripening and inducing agent. Oral misoprostol, the peak serum levels come within 30 minutes. Half-life is around 90 minutes. Maximum duration of action is 2 hours. I have seen some studies which have used 25 microgram every 2 hourly, but we prefer using every 4th hourly. The dose recommended is 25 microgram every 4th hourly for a maximum of 6 doses. Some people use 50 microgram vaginally, but again, with use of 50 microgram, the cause of possibility of hyperstimulation is much more. When we compared oral misoprostol with vaginal misoprostol and vaginal E2, there were fewer cesarean sections with oral misoprostol compared to oxytocin. Sorry, there's a spelling mistake there. Again, when there are studies which have compared oral, vaginal, and sublingual misoprostols. We have done the study in JIPMA. We published it in 2018. There was no difference when we compared the delivery interval or spontaneous vaginal delivery or cesarean section rates. But definitely there was slight hyperstimulation with sublingual route with fetal heart abnormalities, though this was not statistically significant. And also we have found low 1-minute Apgar with sublingual use. Still we continue to use sublingual because we find the progress is much better, though majority of the studies compare and say oral misoprostol is better. The problem with vaginal misoprostol is the chance of it getting expelled is very higher, that's all. Otherwise, or when there is PROM, it may just get washed off, like Cerviprime gets washed off. The next one, what I would like to talk about is vaginal pessary. It is called as Propes. It is now becoming commonly, it's available in India and we are trying to use it. Only problem with it is it's expensive. Basically, it's a vaginal delivery system which consists of a non-biodegradable polymeric drug. It contains 10 milligram of dinoproston PGE2. And it has to be kept in the posterior vaginal fornix after mildly wetting it with saline or distilled water, and you can allow the tail to protrude outside so that we can remove it easily. It has to be kept for 24 hours or the patient goes into labor, whichever is earlier. A repeat dose is not recommended, though in some countries they have been using a repeat dose after 24 hours. Okay, then they have compared vaginal prostaglandin E2 gel and the pessary. All the formulations have been found to have similar effects. But the disadvantage, I said, is it's expensive. And another disadvantage is it has to be deep freezed. And only when you're about to insert, you have to take it out from the deep freezer and you have to insert it. And the cost available in India is around 2,000 to 3,000. Another, we have been using, what we have found is some women have hyperstimulation. So you feel very bad after inserting, something after 2,000, spending 2,000 rupees, you have to immediately remove within 1 or 2 hours is going to be a problem. So we'll have to wait and watch. So finally, what WHO recommends on methods is we should adapt to the local situation. Okay, and we need to see our needs, the availability and the cost which is possible for our patients. The role of local professional societies in using this is very, very important. Now I come to special situations. Previous cesarean. Nowadays we get lots of patients with previous cesarean. It's not possible that we sit and do repeat cesareans for all this. So we do lot of inductions and we do give lot of vaginal birth after cesarean, Tolax. So for this, what do we use? For previous cesarean, as I told you, Foley's is the best method for ripening with or without easy. Majority, if you're using easy, as I said, it's better to use in the first 6 hours before it gets expelled. Of course, the route is vaginal. You can keep Foley's catheter for 24 hours. Sometimes what we do is we give 6 hours of easy, then after that again, 6 plus 24, another 24 hours we keep the Foley's, and we have found quite good results because 50% of them go into active labor. Then once the cervix is ripe, you can give oxytocin, preferably a low dose. And I cannot say how many hours you give. You need to monitor these patients, and depending on how they are progressing, you can give a maximum of 6 to 12 hours. I don't think you should give more than that. PGE2 gel is not recommended, better to avoid. Maybe you can give in patients whom you are very sure of the scar, but better to avoid PGE2 gel. Dilapan is a new upcoming rod, but again, it is expensive. It can be used intracervically. I'm sure if many units use this, then the cost will come down. We are not very sure. In multiple pregnancy, when there is a reason to induce, we can use Foley's, PGE2 or oxytocin, whatever is possible. Women with HIV who are allowed to undergo vaginal delivery, that is when the viral load is very much less and she can undergo vaginal delivery. In those patients, you can use again Foley's, PGE2, PGE1, oxytocin, whatever. In premature rupture of membranes, we can use PGE2, we can use misoprostol. And when you are using PGE2 gel, we can use 2 doses 6 hours apart. Maybe you can go for 3 hours, but remember the number of hours with PROM with the patient comes with is very important. Though there have been studies where you can wait for 24 hours with PROM if there is no maternal and fetal distress. You can wait and then induce after 24 hours. We have done such study also, but there's not much of difference whether we induce or we don't induce. Rather than waiting and then inducing, better to induce the patients. Of course, in this waiting period, maybe around 25 to 30% patients would go into spontaneous labor. You can use misoprostol orally or vaginally or sublingually. The dose is 25 microgram 4th hourly, around 4 to 6 doses. So coming to induction in COVID positive patients, as Dr. Uma has already said, we have also seen there is a lot of literature which has been there in the past 2 months. There is not much difference between patients who are COVID positive and who do not have COVID. As we said, the main problem comes from containment zone. Whatever said and done, electives induction should be delayed because when there is no indication, we should not do it. Okay, but having said that, just because the patient is COVID positive, if there is an indication for induction, we should do the induction. It's not different from, like, suppose patient comes with severe preeclampsia or abruption, we need to deliver. In those patients, we can't wait. But elective inductions like inducing all low-risk primaries at 39 weeks should be avoided. So indication should be done only for obstetric indications. We can use Foley's or a combination of 25 microgram of misoprostol. We can use vaginal pessary or PGE2. Whatever said and done, when we are dealing with COVID patients, we need to take all those precautions, which was already told in the previous talk. I will not go much about it. So there is no difference in induction of COVID positive patients compared to other patients. So now coming to monitoring, yes, I won't go too much into details. Clinical monitoring till the patient goes into active labor is important. And how often you monitor depends on the condition of the patient and the ripening agents used. If you are using misoprostol or oxytocin, then we may have to monitor even closer. But the patient is in latent phase, if you have put Foley's or prostaglandin E2 gel just to ripen the cervix, then early monitoring may be necessary. Best is you ask the patients to note fetal movements. Then partogram should be used once a patient goes into active labor. Of course, electronic fetal monitoring should be used, especially when we are using inducing agents, because there is a risk of fetal heart rate abnormalities, which already has been discussed. Now, what is failed induction? it can be defined in two ways, either failure to deliver vaginally, or some studies also have defined as failure to enter active phase of labor. There is no specific duration or number of agents used to induce labor where you can say, okay, now we can call it as failed induction. So the decision depends on the case. So case to case basis, you need to decide whether the induction has failed or not. Now, if you look at one of the studies, they have said that if induction were designated as failed, if a woman continued to be in latent phase at 15 hours, as opposed to 6 hours after initiation of oxytocin and rupture of membranes, approximately 70,000 addition. That's what they mean is, if you say failed induction after 6 hours, then you may end up doing 4 lakh cesarean sections as compared to waiting for 15 hours when you will be possibly doing only 70,000 cesarean sections. That's what this study has told. So do not come to a conclusion that, okay, I have put 1 PG to gel first, and after 6 hours, there's no change in the bishop and patient is not getting contractions. Please do not call it as failed induction. As I told you, again, you will have to decide whether you would go for induction or go ahead and do cesarean section depending on the condition of the patient. I would like you to look at this. If the cervix is less than 6 centimeters dilated and we are not able to do artificial rupture of membranes and there is no cervical change for 24 hours, then maybe you can call it as failed induction. Again, if you look at this, you have ruptured the membranes and there is no cervical change for 12 to 18 hours of oxytocin. That means after ARM, you can wait for 12 to 18 hours before you call it as failed induction. Of course, in both these conditions, if there is any change in the fetal heart rate or if there is any maternal distress, then also you can consider as failed induction and stop the induction, go ahead with cesarean section. Okay. Now, at what gestational age should you induce? It depends on the situation. If you look at hypertension in pregnancy, usually we induce once they complete 37 weeks. But if the patient develops complications like eclampsia, HELLP syndrome or abruption, you need to deliver even earlier. In severe preeclampsia, at least we can wait till 34 weeks. But again, as I said, induction has to depend on case to case. In diabetic patient who's on medical management, you can wait up to 38 weeks and then induce. If they are just on dietary management, you can even go up to 40 weeks. Rh negative pregnancy, we do not allow the patients to go post-date. So it depends on if there is growth restriction, then again, you may terminate anywhere between 34 to 37 weeks, depending on the condition of the baby. Now the question comes, in low-risk pregnant women, should be induced at 39 weeks. All low-risk pregnant women should be induced at 39 weeks. Now, if you look at a study done in 2010, there's labor induction is significantly associated with an increased risk of cesarean delivery among nulliparous women at term for those with and without medical or obstetric complications. So they said do not induce labor until unless it is necessary. But then what has ARRIVE trial told? What is ARRIVE trial? A randomized trial of induction versus expectant management. The results of ARRIVE trial were there was no significant difference in primary and composite perinatal outcome. There was significant lower incidence of cesarean section in induction group. So by waiting to go beyond 40 to 41 weeks, the indication for cesarean becomes more, maybe because of decreased liquor and meconium staining. It was a good randomized control trial. It was done across 41 hospitals. It was a multi-center trial. The sample size on the whole was very good, and all the patients were ascertained gestational age exactly before 20 weeks. So only those patients were recruited. Whoever had a good gestational age estimation by ultrasound before 20 weeks only were recruited to the study. But the limitations was there was no standard protocol which was followed for ripening. It was not powered to detect the individual adverse outcomes. And it was not blinded, hence selection bias of cases may be there. Economic aspects were not studied. So if you look at the possible reasons why there was increased section rates in expectant group was the age more than 35 years. If you see 4.5% in expectant group had higher age, 64.2% had a poor bishop. But the most important is previous pregnancy loss. See, whenever there is a previous pregnancy loss, especially at term, we try to deliver them earlier. If you look at the statistics here, in induction group, it was 77.2%, no previous pregnancy loss, whereas in expected group, it was 74.4%. So with the previous pregnancy loss, we have a very low threshold for cesarean section, and that was statistically significant. Okay. So there was another meta-analysis which said again that there was significantly lower risk of cesarean delivery, maternal and peripartum infection, and perinatal adverse outcomes, including respiratory morbidity, intensive care unit admission, and so on. So they advised to do elective induction at 39 weeks. Yes, it is very good if you can do. But what should be the recommendation in our setting? Is it possible for us to do? We need to take, as Dr. Uma was telling, we need to take resources into consideration, especially monitoring, personnel, and also what the patients want. We need to do similar studies in our country to see whether such protocols would suit our population. It is very easy when you have 1 or 2 patients, but if you have a busy labor room like this, if you do not have adequate monitoring facilities, and you do not have inadequate doctors, then we should not end up a low risk into high risk. See, whatever said and done, induction has its own problems. So you should not make a patient who was otherwise normal, inducing her, and she develops complications. That is what should be avoided. So if you look at complications in general for induction, they can have hyperstimulation or whatever, tachysystole. You can have fetal heart abnormalities. The risk of infection is higher, especially when you do not use aseptic techniques. Risk of cord prolapse. Many a time our residents come and tell we do not want to put Foley's because the head is at -5 station. Yes, they are worried about cord prolapse. Uterine rupture, especially if the patient is left unmonitored. Though we use oxytocin for postpartum hemorrhage, the same oxytocin, if the patient has not responded, especially in those with failed induction, the risk of atonic PPH is very high. And whatever said and done, nothing like patient coming in labor, delivering and going home. With induction, obviously the hospital stay will definitely get prolonged. So the success of induction depends on what is the age group of patient. Younger the age, better the response to induction. Multiparity, obviously. Body mass index, if it is less than 30, a favorable cervix. More than one method may be required if you have an unfavorable cervix. A birth weight of less than 3,500 grams, that means there may be a probability of CPD if it is more than that. And of course, the monitoring facilities and personnel make a difference in success. So with this, my take-home message is there needs to be a proper indication for induction. Method of choice depends on the case and also on the Bishop score. We may require a combination of methods for induction. Do not label a patient as failed induction once a single method doesn't work. We can wait up to 12 to 15 hours when the patient is induced, provided there is no maternal or fetal compromise. And there is always a higher risk for cesarean section. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Leda, for that wonderful lecture. And it was really informative. The questions are pouring. I think we can spend some time for questions as well. Am I right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Meanwhile, I'm compiling these questions. Dr. Wahab or Dr. Uma can start asking the questions and start the discussion.
Lata, just to talk about induction in a COVID positive case.
Yeah.
I think that's where there is a lot of anxiety that is generated.
Yeah.
Because if somebody is asymptomatic positive,
yes,
then my understanding is we are best, as you said, best wait
leave her alone.
Leave her alone. If we have to induce, while there is no risk from the induction, the concern, I think, is the amount of healthcare worker time So a lot of units are just electively sectioning.
Doing scissors. Yeah, I did read some literature. They said just because, I mean, they have told this, though we can induce patients just because of the fear of spending a lot of time with the patient, people are resorting to cesarean section, though that is not recommended. Even we have thought initially when any patient comes, we will do sections, but then we don't know if the numbers pour in more, then we don't know what is the situation. Will we be ending up doing cesarean sections in almost 75 to 80% of the patients, which becomes a burden. Right now, I think it's too early to say whether to induce or not to induce. It's okay if we can do section right now, but I don't know what will happen in future when all the borders are opening up from June 8th. So at that time, we don't know what will the situation be.
Okay, fair enough.
Dr. Leda, there is a question that should we use antibiotics while during induction or what's best antibiotic?
No, not at all. Please use aseptic precautions. That is the most important thing which is important. There is no role for antibiotics except even for a heart disease patients, we do not use antibiotics unless they go into labor. And there are criteria, the WHO classification 3, only there antibiotics have to be used. But in India, once they go into labor, we do give ampicillin and gentamicin, that to 1 dose. Otherwise, there is no role for antibiotics.
Another comment and question is terbutaline injection still available? We now use only nifedipine for tocolysis, even in the setting of hyperstimulation. But observe that in most instances, the hyperstimulation following prostaglandins invariably returns after an initial response to tocolysis, especially in the presence of unfavorable cervix. What is your experience?
We do get hyperstimulation. So hyperstimulation in the sense when the contractions are more, first thing we should do is stop oxytocin, wait for some time for an hour or so, and then you restart oxytocin at a low dose. Of course, terbutaline is available. We do not routinely use for all patients. Maybe if it is recurrent, you can use. In spite of that, if there is hyperstimulation and you need to deliver her, then in those cases with an unfavorable cervix, we may resort to section. Because in these patients, they may have some kind of fetal heart rate variabilities too. But I don't think we should give terbutaline as the first line of management. First thing is stop, put her in left lateral position. Sometimes we give oxygen by mask, then that settles this thing. 50% of the patients do not come back with hyperstimulation. We do continue oxytocin at a lower dose. Yes, if it's still persistent.
Patient be hospitalized after Foley catheter induction or can send home?
Depends on the patient. In our situation, we will not send, we keep them here. But with Foley's, there are studies which have shown, I mean, they can stay at home, but again, it depends on the patient and the doctor. Not in a busy setup like ours, and most of our patients come from very far off place. We can't afford to send them. Otherwise, you can.
And what's the possibility of infection following the use of Dilapan?
This is still in experimental basis. This is as good as Foley's. If you use aseptic precautions, I don't think there should be a risk of infection. I mean, these are still experimental. One of our colleagues has started the study where in previous cesareans, in some 20 patients right now, we have not seen any infection. Again and again, I say infection is because of us. If we do not use any aseptic precautions, the chance of infection are higher.
Okay, so all COVID-related questions, I'm just skipping because it has been answered by several people. And the next question is, in spite of all methods of ripening cervix, it remains unfavorable. Can we take it as an indication for CS, like failed ripening, just like failed induction?
All methods in the sense you have put Foley's, you have put Cerviprime. See, I told you last resort you can even do ARM, artificial rupture of membranes. In spite of that, and give oxytocin for 6 to 12 hours. If it's not responding, then you need to, depends on what is the indication. If you are going to, 39 weeks, low risk, if you're just inducing, I prefer to leave her alone. And I've also seen many of the patients when we put this ripening agents and left them alone, 50% of them do go into spontaneous labor. So it depends on what is the condition, what you think is this thing. You leave them alone for some time if there is no real indication to deliver. Many of them do go into spontaneous labor. Of course, with monitoring her. You need to monitor the fetal heart, you need to monitor maternal fever, any such things which are occurring, because the risk of choreoamnitis may be there. So,
Can I just add
Yeah, please.
to that? No, I completely agree that we need to give more time with these inductions. We've had inductions going on sometimes into a third day when there is no
Yeah.
response. But the only point I want to add to everything Lata said is
Yes.
it all boils down to setting the expectation of the patient and the family. So right at the start, they have to be prepared that induction means it can take
Yeah, 3 to 4
then
days.
at the end of one dose or two doses, they are not getting anxious, you're not getting anxious, and
Yeah.
family. And if they have, at least in a private setup, if they have issues of day and star and everything gets ironed out before the process starts, and it doesn't factor into a reason for truncating the induction halfway through.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's just want to emphasize that.
Exactly. I mean, that's what when we induce the patients, we always tell them it's not like today we start inducing by night she delivers. So again, case to case basis, it has to be discussed with the patient, told to them that depending on the favorability of cervix, that we can approximately give some time, maybe 3 days, maybe 4 days. So they understand.
And the next question is, can we use misoprost such as that the 3 doses today, third being like at 8 p.m. and restart it tomorrow after 10 a.m.? What would be the effect?
No, but why you want to start induction? If you are starting induction, it means you want to deliver her, right? So why you want to give night one dose? Then there's no such recommendation. If you're using, you may do a study and see what it is. But as such, why you want to give one after 12 hours? No. See, remember the onset of action and duration of action is very short. So the cumulative effect is there if you give every 4th hourly or 6th hourly. If you give a longer period of time, that the cumulative effect may die off, then your whole purpose of induction may not solve.
And does Foxy has a consent form, recommended consent form for induction of labor? Does Foxy, do they recommend?
Not to my knowledge.
I don't think so. We have our own consent forms for individual institute saying all these reasons, this may take time and this is the indication why we are inducing, but I don't think so.
Okay, and lot of appreciations for both of you. And combination, another last question. The combination of Foley's catheter followed by misoprostol after 24 hours, followed by oxytocin after 24 hours, thus prolonging induction up to about 48 hours in unfavorable cervix. Is it possible?
Anything is possible. That's what I said. No, it depends on the indication. Suppose she has preeclampsia or diabetes, we cannot afford to wait long. Remember, though we have said we can wait in these conditions, already there is hypoxia. On top of that, induction with each uterine contraction, definitely the risk of hypoxia for the fetus is more. But if it is a low risk patient, I don't see any reason why we cannot delay it. By waiting, the cervix gets more ripened, more softer, they'll respond better to oxytocin later.
And yeah, please.
One thing, Dr. Lata, there is some authorities and some studies which is mifepristone for induction. We have tried that very much in term intrauterine death patients.
Yes,
and
yes.
even for live, it hold good. That is what your
Okay.
study says. What about your take on that?
I didn't really mention that because I didn't find much difference in the studies. We also use for intrauterine death, but again, the induction to delivery interval was not that much significant. So not many studies, and whatever studies have shown, they have not found much significance. We have not done with live babies. We have done only with intrauterine death. So maybe it's a good possibility for intrauterine death, especially when they are not responding. And for IUDs, there is no need to be in a hurry to induce. They may deliver if you leave them alone. Even if you start induction, there's no hurry to finish off within 24 or 48 hours. So in those cases, maybe mifepristone I'm not very sure of that because we don't use it. Yeah. That's why I didn't bring in. I wanted to mention,
Yeah,
but
no mention.
yeah.
You're not mentioned, yeah.
I just mentioned in the induction, but I forgot to talk about that. Yeah.
So Foxy in their good practice guideline
Guidelines.
does have an appendix where they talk about information that needs to be conveyed to the
Given to
woman,
the patients. Yeah.
a checklist. There is a consent form there, but I don't think it, I mean, it's not like everybody is using that consent
Using.
form. But to answer that question, it is there in the Foxy guidance.
Foxy guidelines. Yeah.
And Dr. Leda, do you have that consent form with you? If you have it, you
Right
just
now,
go
I
to us.
don't have. Right now, I don't have. I'm sorry. It's there.
I can project the Foxy one if you want.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think you
so
can
please,
add. You can
just
project.
project it.
Actually, we can download it. I forgot it was there. We can download it from the website. You can project it. I think I also have.
Yeah, I'll just share. So you have to stop sharing, I think, Lata. then
Okay,
I-
yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, I did.
Actually, few hospitals even have even the consent form for delivery. When they get
Yeah.
admit, they used to have some delivery
Yeah.
consent form. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this
Yeah,
is
that
the,
is-
can you see the form?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we give a information leaflet and we take consent verbally. We don't do a written consent yet for induction of labor, but we give them a leaflet which tells them what induction is. This is the consent form that is there in the Foxy GCPR.
Yeah, I think nowadays for every small thing, like he was telling, even for delivery, we need a consent with
Yeah.
the problems which are occurring for everything, we need a consent form.
Yeah.
Because there is a case on episiotomy we had in High Court of Kerala. Episiotomy happened to be rectovaginal fistula.
Okay.
Then the question was whether the procedure is a surgical procedure, whether the consent was taken or not from the judge. So the gynecologist was in
But there
dilemma
are
what to
certain
do.
things like implied consent. This don't require, I mean, we need not go out of the way to do that because implied consent has a big role. So it's understood, like, okay, we are doing something like external cephalic version or, giving a TOLAC, then maybe. But episiotomy is a routine thing which has to be taken.
No, but the thing is that the patient was a multigravida. And
yeah, even in multi, the baby is bigger or if you're applying instrument, there's
but
no
the lawyer,
contraindication in giving.
I think
but the lawyer of the patient side asked, means they plead that it was not a necessity. So it's done without the consent of the patient. That is why rectovaginal fistula happens. So a compensation is given.
No, in that case, we should tell that without giving episiotomy, it would have become worse. It would have gone more beyond that.
But what the judge said, it's a minor surgical procedure. It is a surgical procedure. You have to take a consent. They don't know episiotomy is a minor, major. Yeah, they don't know. It's a surgical procedure.
And we'll have some few more interesting questions. Is isolated oligohydramnios with normal growth profile an indication for indication? If so, what is the choice?
Not really. Yeah. Not really isolated oligohydramnios. We did a study, asked patient to take hydration. You do the NST or CTG and see if there's any variation. Otherwise, I don't think we need to induce till, I mean, if the Leica is not improving, if the patient says decreased fetal movements, or if you find some abnormality on fetal heart, then yes. But I don't think we need to worry about it until unless the Leica falls to, less than 4. It's really going to oligohydramnios, not just decreased Leica. When we say oligohydramnios, it's less than 5. Yes, in those patients, we are concerned. You can give them hydration for some time, oral hydration, not necessary to give IV, and monitor them. And if there's no improvement, yes, in those cases we should, because oligohydramnios, cord compression, the risk of meconium stained Leica and meconium aspiration may be more. But just decreased Leica, when the Leica is above 5, you can give oral hydration and wait for a week while monitoring.
Okay, and in case of IUD, what's the dosage of mifepristone?
That I think Dr. Abdul will answer
Actually,
that. I don't-
actually, in term IUD, we used to give the mifepristone either 200 daily for consecutive 3 days or 600 at a start dose, and within 24 to 48 hours, patient will get the labor pain. That we used to see, and within third day or fourth day, normally out of 90%, it will get delivered. That is our experience. We are using it.
Maybe we have to start. We have not been using mifepristone at all. Actually, we wait. Majority of the patients, once a baby gets macerated, it's easier to deliver. You won't have other problems. Majority will go into labor within 3 to 4 days. If they don't, yes,
You can even send patient to home also.
Yeah. We also tell, yes, exactly. See, but the fear for them is the dead fetus inside the uterus, chance of infection, and all those things. But basically, we need to talk to them and wait.
Yeah, with that, I think we have compiled most of the questions and put it across. And very interesting to share that we had almost 500 plus registrations, and our society membership is only around 120. So I think we will not stop doing these webinars. And even after the COVID also, I think we'll stop doing the physical conferences. It is quite comfortable. Lata is sitting at home. Dr. Umma is sitting at home. We can see it's very comfortable. No need to travel. You can have
Thankfully,
lunch.
there is no break in the this thing, internet or current. Otherwise,
we will not give lunch. So lot of anyway, everybody is trying to reduce weight, so unnecessarily we need not waste food also. So that's a quite interesting thing. Quite interesting thing. Both the talks were excellent. The appreciations are pouring in. I think I might have gone through at least more than 30 plus appreciations for both lectures. And this is the first of our current concepts in obstetric management series. We'll go ahead with the further topics in the coming weeks, maybe one or twice in a month. So that's what we plan, not to intoxicate again with webinars.
Thank you.
Mohiddin, I want to thank you profusely, and also Uma, because she has put in a lot of things which I didn't have to talk about again. And Abdul Wahab, and also my mentor, Dr. Habib, is always my backbone for support. Whatever it is, I discuss with him. So it's nice that I'm.
But he has been very busy these days with a lot of. Actually, the teachers are more busy now because of the online classes preparations. But I can tell you, the students, I have 2 daughters at home. The online classes, what is happening when you take the classes, I can see.
They're sleeping.
Watching Netflix and TikTok, doing TikTok and all. So that's quite interesting, wonderful. You can hold them on. And we don't know what the attendees are also doing, whether they are listening or not. Actually, it is the speaker's ability to hold them back. I think all the attendees are still online, and that is real appreciation for both of your talks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
And also, I would like to thank, on behalf of the society, I would like to thank the Shield Pharmaceuticals, who have provided us all the support for this academic venture, and the technical help has been provided by the technical team of Shield. So sincere thanks, and express the gratitude to all the speakers and attendees. Dr. Wahab, you can just conclude.
Nothing to add, because this is a wonderful talk by Dr. Lata and Dr. Umaram, and wonderful participation across. And thank you very much for your detailed description and detailed talk on this topic. And I think we will wind up here.
Yeah, Dr. We'll hand over the memento when we meet.
One thing I want to say, Mohiddin, thanks to this webinars, travel, food cost, mementos, all this has come down, and COVID cost, no COVID.
Yeah, mementos we'll get ready. We'll give you when we meet. Okay, thank you.
And also, one more thing. And also, I can even stand with lungi also here, like this.
Oh my God!
I can be with lungi only. Upper is okay, and lower I am in lungi in my home.
It's getting recorded.
Okay. So
thank you all.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good day.
Bye. Yeah. Thank you.